Hello, welcome to our webinar called Your Voice, Your Choice, Proactive Care Planning for Healthcare Wishes. My name is Hilary Walker. I am the Program Coordinator for Advanced Care Planning for PeaceHealth Northwest Network, and I am a trained advanced care planning facilitator and instructor with Honoring Choices Pacific Northwest, and grateful to be with you here today. So before we get started, if you don't already have a blank form or advanced directive document, please visit our website, and it's listed here on the slide, www.peacehealth.org/advance-care-planning-resources to download and print the short form of the Alaska Advanced Directive. The document we'll be working with today is the document created by the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, or ANTHC, and you will see the opportunity to download that document before we get started. If this is your first time creating an advanced directive, we encourage you to think of a form as a worksheet. So keep your pen moving, and you can print out as many documents as you want until you feel like you have one that adequately represents what you want it to say. If you prefer, you can use a pencil or sticky notes to allow for mistakes or reconsidering your answers to the questions on the document. Keep in mind that once the document is complete, it can be revised or revisited at any time. And I just would love to mention that if you have someone in mind who would be named as a medical decision maker on your behalf on these documents, please invite them to join you for this conversation. It's really helpful to be present and be witness for each other when we're engaging in this work. So today we'll be looking at discovering medical advanced care planning and why it's important, how to reflect on your values and personal beliefs, and why this is really important when considering medical decisions, how to select a healthcare agent or medical decision maker and things to consider in that process. And then lastly, how to express these wishes in a legal document or an advanced health directive. Once the document is complete, we'll also be talking about how to share the document and where to keep these documents, where to store them so that they can be easily accessible if they're ever needed. So let's just start with what is advanced care planning. So advanced care planning or proactive care planning is really just what it sounds like. It's the process of thinking in advance about the care that we would want if we had a medical event or condition and we were unable to speak for ourselves. And we'll also be looking at who we would have speak for us if we cannot speak for ourselves in those situations, either temporarily or more long-term. Advanced care planning involves creating a plan and putting the plan in writing, and then sharing it with those who have some investment in our care. So the focus on these documents can sometimes be quite narrow. So we'll be looking at how to complete the medical advance directive and how to make it a valid legal document. But you'll also hear me say several times throughout this talk about the conversation and how important it is to engage in conversation with anyone on our care team, whether it be a family member, a friend, our doctor, to make sure that we're engaging in regular conversations about what's really important to us. I hope our work today inspires planning in related areas, such as aging in place, in-home care, any supported living options that might be helpful, the understanding and use of palliative care and hospice, body disposition, or how we want our bodies cared for at our time of death. So engaging in these conversations can often bring up conversations around other issues as well. So what is an advanced healthcare directive? When we're looking at these documents, we really think that they are communicating two different things. Some documents have two distinctive parts. The first piece is often called the durable power of attorney for healthcare. In the Alaska document, it's Part 1, Healthcare Agent. So this gives you the opportunity to name the people who you would trust to make medical decisions on your behalf if you were unable to make them for yourself. And we'll be diving a little bit deeper into that. So that's really the first part of the document. The second part of the document is often called a healthcare directive or directive to physician. It's often called a living will. The Alaska document we'll be using, it's part 2, which is instructions for healthcare. And that's where we have the opportunity to discuss what kind of decisions we would make in certain medical scenarios, or what decisions we would want our healthcare agent to make on our behalf. So I invite you to go ahead and pull the document out. Again, this is the first page that you should see on the Advanced Healthcare Directive. Again, this piece of the document is sometimes called a durable power of attorney. The person you name in this document is sometimes called a healthcare proxy, a surrogate decision maker. So sometimes it's helpful to just visit that language and understand what we're talking about here. So as we go through this document, I won't necessarily read everything word for word, but I do encourage you to spend some time looking at the specific instructions and information on this document. Some pieces of it I will read because I think it's really important to get a full understanding of what these documents do for us. So we'll start on page 1, and I'm just going to read the top few sentences there. You have the choice to make your own healthcare decisions and choose someone to make healthcare decisions for you if you cannot. This form will let you do either or both of these things. Filling out this form is your choice. This process is always voluntary. You can change, cross out, or add your own words to any part of this directive. When signed, dated, and witnessed or notarized, this form meets the legal requirements for an advanced healthcare directive under Alaska law. So if we look at part 1, healthcare agent, I'm just going to read this piece as well to understand what this means to name someone in this section. If I cannot make my own healthcare decisions or choices as determined by my healthcare team, I trust the following person or persons to make my healthcare choices for me. This person is at least 18 years of age and is not my healthcare provider or employed by my healthcare provider, unless, of course, that person is related to you by birth, marriage, or adoption. So we're going to talk a little bit about choosing a healthcare agent. This is really the most important part of this whole process. So we'll come back to this page 1, but I'd like to talk a little bit about choosing a healthcare agent and walking through this process. So choosing a healthcare agent, the requirements for who you choose, the person has to be at least 18 years of age. I think even older is helpful, as 18 is quite young to make medical decisions on behalf of somebody else. But the person you choose has to be at least 18 years old. The person cannot be your physician or physician's employee. So that exception stands that if the person you would choose happens to be your physician or your physician's or employed with your physician, and they are also a family member, you can choose that person with the understanding that when they act as your healthcare decision maker or healthcare agent, that is the hat they're wearing. They are no longer your provider or an employee of your provider. Who you choose can also not be an administrator, an owner, or an employee of a facility where you live or receive care. So some things to consider about the qualities of a good healthcare agent. These are really important things to think about. Who you choose should be willing to have conversations with you about your values and wishes. They should be willing to follow your wishes, even if they disagree with those wishes for themselves. So sometimes who we choose as our healthcare decision maker may have a very different idea about how they would want their care handled if they had a serious illness or accident. And it's fine if they have different ideas. It's just very important that they would be willing to follow your wishes, even if they don't agree with them or necessarily understand them. It's very helpful if you have the opportunity to choose somebody who can make decisions in stressful and emotionally challenging situations. If you're listening to this call and you've ever been a medical decision maker for somebody else or had to make decisions for somebody else in an emergency situation, you understand that it can sometimes be very stressful. And sometimes You're having to navigate conversations with other family members who may not have such a strong understanding of what the person might want. So really important to have somebody who can be very strong for you in this role. Lastly, whoever you choose has to agree to be your healthcare agent. So in some states, who you choose has to actually sign the document to say, I understand what this means and I'm willing to do this. That's not required on this document that we're using from Alaska, but we do strongly encourage and really recommend that you talk to whoever you name on this document and let them know that you've named them on a legal document, review the document with them, and make sure that they are willing and able to follow your wishes. So let's talk briefly about what happens if you don't choose a healthcare agent. We're very aware that this conversation and putting these thoughts into writing can be very overwhelming for a lot of people. You're not alone if that's how you feel about this. But I think it's really important to understand what happens when you don't complete these documents, when you don't take the opportunity to choose who you trust to make medical decisions on your behalf. So what we're looking at here is the Alaska Legal Order of Decision Maker Hierarchy. And what that basically means is that if you had a sudden or unexpected event or a chronic illness that got much worse and you were unable to speak for yourself, it would make sense that we have to talk to somebody. Somebody who knows you will need to make decisions on your behalf. And if you have not named somebody in a legal advance directive, then there is a legal order of people that we have to talk to. So if you look at this document, you can see the first one on the list is a guardian appointed by the state. This is a fairly rare situation, but if somebody has a guardian appointed by the state, then that is their number one medical decision maker. Next in line is the individual that you have named as your healthcare representative or healthcare agent. So this is really important to know that who you name on the document is at the top of the list. Again, if you don't have a guardian appointed by the state. So when we go down the list under healthcare representative or healthcare agent, this is if you don't choose somebody in a legal document. So if you have not chosen somebody, we will automatically need to talk with your spouse. So sometimes people will say, well, that's who I would automatically choose anyway, so maybe I don't need to do this document. But you'll notice when we go back to the option of choosing a healthcare decision maker that you can choose a backup. So think about who could support your spouse. So again, it would be really important to look at these documents. Another thing to think about is that sometimes our spouse is not the best person to make medical decisions on our behalf. If we think about the qualities of a healthcare agent and somebody who is willing to follow our wishes, even if they don't agree with them, and could potentially handle really stressful situations, sometimes when it's somebody who we're very attached to and who we love very deeply, it's hard to be that person's medical decision maker and really see things from their perspective. Another thing to consider if you're considering choosing your spouse as your medical decision maker is that the beauty and the challenge of growing old together is that our spouse may have a chronic medical condition themselves, and that condition may be exacerbated or worsened by having to make medical decisions on our behalf. So some things to consider when we're choosing a medical decision maker, and to understand, again, if you haven't chosen somebody else, your decision maker will automatically be your spouse. If you do not have a spouse, the next in line for making decisions on your behalf are your adult children. And it's important to understand that you can see the small asterisk there. If there are more than one person in any group, then all the people in the group should agree to care. So, for example, if you have 5 children over the age of 18 and you have not specifically chosen someone else to make medical decisions for you, all 5 of those children will be consulted and will need to agree on the type of care you would or would not get. So you can imagine that can get quite complicated. In Alaska, if you have no spouse and no adult children, again have not named anyone on a legal document, next in line to make decisions on your behalf are your parents. And the thing to understand again about this is if you have more than one parent, even if they have been legally divorced, both parents must be given the opportunity to weigh in on your medical decisions and come to some agreement. If you no longer have living parents, the next in line are your adult siblings. And same thing, all of your adult siblings over the age of 18. If you have more than one, they have to all be called into the conversation. Last in line are your adult relative or a close friend. So you can see that if you do not take the time to complete an advanced healthcare directive, and you choose to allow us to go to this legal order of decision making, it's good to just understand that this is the list that we'll come to, and sometimes it can get quite complicated. So it really is in your best interest and everyone involved to take some time to think about who would best act as your healthcare decision maker. So if we go back to page 1, going back to part 1, healthcare agent, you see you have the opportunity to name 2 people. So you have your primary person, that's your number 1 person you want involved no matter what. Now, a question that comes up sometimes is, does this person need to be living locally? Not necessarily. This should be really the person that you trust the most. They should be reachable for sure. So if you have a son you plan on naming who's gone on a fishing boat for 6 months out of the year, then you may want to consider somebody who's more easily reachable. So your healthcare agent, again, does not need to be related to you by blood or marriage. So when you name them, your healthcare agent is my, and then relationship. It can be a friend, it can be a brother, sister, aunt, uncle, etc. You want to give a name, an address, and most importantly, the phone number where they can be most easily reached. And you'll see the alternate agent says, if the above person is not willing or able to speak for me, I choose the following person as my alternate healthcare agent. So that gives you the option of choosing a backup person. And again, relationship of that person is very helpful for us to understand when we're speaking to them. So I'm not going to read this section of to the extent allowed by Alaska law that what your healthcare agent has a right to do on your behalf, but I think it would be really important for you to review it, especially when you're talking with somebody about choosing them as your healthcare decision maker. And you'll see at the bottom of page 1 is name and date of birth, and that will be on every page moving forward. And that just helps us make sure that every page of your document ends up in your medical record at the hospital exactly where it needs to be. So we're going to go to part 2, instructions for healthcare. So if a time comes that I am very sick and not able to make my own healthcare choices or decisions, I want my medical providers and healthcare agent to respect and follow my wishes as they are written here, even if they are different than his or her own. I understand that whatever my healthcare choices are, I will get the best care possible. If I have a serious illness, injury, or illness that cannot be cured, the following is most important to me. So there are 2 options to choose from here, and you choose which one most aligns with what you believe is true for yourself. The first option is, again, if I have a serious illness or injury that cannot be cured or changed, the following is most important to me. The first option that you have an opportunity to initial or put an X on the line is the length of my life is most important to me, even if it means I need extended intensive care and life support. So if it's most important to you to live as long as possible, even if it means extended time in an intensive care unit or with life support or life-sustaining treatment, then this is the option you would choose. And we'll have an opportunity later in the document to get more specific about what that treatment might look like. Or is the quality of your life more important to you? I wish to avoid extended intensive care and life support. So the quality of my life that I have is more important than the quantity of my life, than the length of my life. So it's just starting to get the conversation going about what you really value and what's most important to you at this time in your life. There is an opportunity for comments. If you want to give any more specific information, you're welcome to do that here. So what is most important to you? Feel free to write again in that comment section. Are there any exceptions? How long would you be willing to receive care? What would be your hoped for outcome? Is there any additional information that might be helpful? So you'll see in this next section that if I have a serious illness or injury that cannot be cured, so in that above scenario that we're talking about, I would not want my life prolonged if I was unable to do the following. So if I had a serious injury or an illness that cannot be cured, I would not want my life prolonged if, and you can initial as many as feel right for you. You can also put an X if initial is challenging. So again, if I have a serious illness or injury that cannot be cured, I would not want my life prolonged if I am not able to care for myself. So those activities of daily living, feed, bathe, toilet, and dress without help, if I'm not able to do those things, if I cannot think clearly or make my own decisions, if I do not recognize or cannot interact with my loved ones, or if I am showing signs of suffering that cannot be relieved. So again, you can check every line, you can choose which ones sound most true for you, and then you do have the opportunity of writing any other scenarios or any other function that you do on a daily basis that you would not be willing to live without. Another way of looking at this is what quality of engagement is most important to you physically and mentally. So engagement, what I mean by that is how important it is for you to be able to engage with the world around you, either physically, so being able to get up and move myself from point A to point B, or mentally or cognitively, how important is it for you to be able to really truly engage with the world around you? The last section on here is my medical preferences at end of life are, the first option is, if possible, I wish to spend the last days of my life at home or in a home-like setting where I can be cared for by family and friends. And again, just to point out, these are preferences. In some situations, it is not possible to get somebody home, but what you're saying is, if it was up to me and I knew I was at end of life, these are my preferences. So again, the first one, if possible, I wish to spend the last days of my life at home or in a home-like setting where I can be cared for by my family and friends. Or, if possible, I wish to spend the last days of my life in a hospital or a medical home or medical care facility. So sometimes people prefer very strongly to be at home, and sometimes people prefer very strongly to be in a more medical setting. And it's really up to you what feels most important to you. Or you can choose let my healthcare agent decide. So again, who you've named on the previous page, would you want them to decide? And you can see there's a little space here where you have the opportunity to give them a little bit more information so that they know they're making a decision in alignment with what's important to you. So let my healthcare agent to decide whatever's easiest for my family is something I've seen people write here, whatever is cheapest, it doesn't matter to me, etc. So if you can include just a little bit of wording in your own writing, again, these documents are meant to be a guide or a map for somebody else to follow in order to provide care most in alignment with what's important to you. And again, at the bottom of page 2 is an opportunity to write your name and date of birth. So we're going to page 3. This is instructions for healthcare continued. That part of the document, sometimes called a healthcare directive or living will. And it gives you an opportunity here to write some things in your own handwriting. And I really encourage you to spend some time with this piece. We have heard so often from families how valuable it is to see information in their loved one's own handwriting. I imagine that you may have had the experience when you get a letter in the mail, which is a lost art, but when we see something in somebody's own handwriting, oftentimes we hear their voice in our mind. And that's super helpful in these times when somebody's really trying to do the best that they can to care for you if you're unable to speak for yourself. So you see there's an opportunity here in the last days of my life. These are important things to know. So some examples that they provide on the document are personal messages, that could include how you feel about life, how you feel about death, how you feel about what happens after death, anything that you would want to share in a personal message. Who is important to you? What do you want your legacy to be? Any messages like that. Sharing ways to care for you. What kind of music would you want to be played? Are there people that you wish to see and or spiritual practices or readings? So another way to think of it is religious, personal, or cultural beliefs that are important to you, that would be helpful for those who are caring for you to understand. Any rites or rituals or ceremonies that you would want done if you were seriously ill or even at end of life. Please be aware, I see that there's only 3 lines here, and we want to make sure that your writing is easy to read. If you want to include additional information, you can always add an additional page, and you would just want to make sure you include at the end of this line, please see additional pages for more information. The next section of this document allows you to speak to some decisions that your family can make on your behalf as it's related to organ donation and how you want your body cared for at when you die. So for organ donation, after my death, you can initial the one that matters most to you. I want to donate my needed organs or tissues. I want to donate only the following organs or tissues. I do not want to donate any of my organs or tissues, or let my healthcare agent to decide. And again, you can cross this section out or any section in this document if you don't want to comment, but it gives you an opportunity to have a say in this piece. The next section is after my death, I want, and there are some options here. Initial the one that matters most to you. I want to be buried. I want to be cremated. I want my loved ones to decide. I want my final resting place to be, and you can name a location here. Again, if there are other options that you're aware of that you want to explore and write into the document, you're welcome to do that. This is often one of the last decisions that your family members will need to make on behalf of your care. And even when we talk about it, or we think that our family knows what we would want because of family tradition or personal beliefs, oftentimes what we find is family can forget in that moment of grief. So if you have the opportunity to just specify how you want your body cared for, how you want your body honored at the time of death, it's super helpful to include that here. And you can get as specific as you want to, but again, if you have very specific rites or rituals or ceremonies that you want done, it does not need to be on this medical directive. You can include it in an additional direction section, and most importantly, that your family is aware of what those ceremonies or rituals might be. It's also really important to understand what your options are where you live. So an example is if you live on an island that is very far from the mainland, it's important to understand what are your options for care of the body and what are things that your family needs to know in advance. The next section is speaking about CPR. So CPR is Cardiopulmonary Resuscitation. And I'm going to go forward to the next slide where we offer a CPR guide to guide this conversation a bit more about CPR, and then we'll come back to this section about CPR. So this CPR guide is created by the Washington State Medical Association and Hospital Association, but they are national statistics to provide some information for people about CPR. And again, I'm not going to read this word for word, but it's important to understand that CPR is not as successful as a lot of people think, because a lot of the times that we see CPR is on TV or in movies where somebody may collapse and then CPR is done for just a moment and then they bounce back up and everything is fine. So it's important to understand that CPR is only initiated once somebody's heart and breathing has stopped. So CPR can include a breathing tube, or sometimes called intubation, to help get oxygen into your body, and deep pushing on the chest, which are sometimes called compressions, to help move the blood. Sometimes electric shock can be used with a defibrillator or an AED, which are becoming more common in public areas, if you are experiencing what is considered a quote-unquote shockable rhythm. So again, if you want to understand more about CPR, feel free to talk with your provider about it. Will CPR work for you is a really good question to ask your provider. So CPR really works best on people who are healthy and when CPR is started right away. So again, taking into consideration those of you who live in rural areas, again, more of a conversation to have with your provider. CPR is less likely to be successful if you are weak, elderly, or have a chronic illness. Now, national studies show that 18 to 30% of people who receive CPR in a hospital setting survive and are discharged from the hospital. So again, that is cardiac arrest being noticed right away, CPR started right away. The survival rate is actually lower than what most people anticipate. Of those people who do survive, 28% of them are shown to have significant neurologic disability. And the reason why this is because when the heart stops beating, it stops taking oxygenated blood to our brain. So this can be quite devastating for the brain if it is a prolonged period of time that the brain goes without oxygen. So again, this information is not in any way meant to scare you or dissuade you from making a choice about CPR that feels right for you. But again, these webinars and this information is just to help make you more aware of what the reality of these medical treatments are and to have a really informed conversation with your provider. So we're going to go back to the CPR part of the document itself. In the event that my heart stops beating and my breathing stops, you want to initial one that matters most to you. So in the event that my heart stops beating and my breathing stops, I want CPR. I want to try to be resuscitated no matter how sick or injured I am. That's your choice. That's option number one. Or I want CPR for my current state of health unless this document is being used and I now have the following. I now have an injury or an illness that cannot be cured and I am dying. I have no reasonable chance of recovery from a cardiac arrest, or I have little chance of survival, and my medical providers think that CPR would be more harmful than helpful. So that's the second option. And again, that says I want CPR for my current state of health, but if I'm unable to make medical decisions and this document is being used on my behalf, at that point, if I have an injury or illness that cannot be cured or changed, etc., at that point, I would not want to receive CPR if my heart and breathing stops. I would instead want to allow a natural death. The third option is I do not want CPR at all for my current state of health or ever. If my heart stops beating or my breathing stops, I wish to allow a natural death. Now, if you're choosing this third option, it's very important to understand that this advanced directive cannot be followed outside of the hospital by emergency responders. So if you put this document on your refrigerator, the only thing that emergency responders can follow is a medical order signed by a provider, or excuse me, a physician. So it's very important to understand if you say, I do not want CPR, never, ever, no way, then you need to chat with your provider or physician about what's called a Comfort One form. And we're not going to go too much into that in this webinar. Again, it would be a conversation to have with your physician. But what a Comfort One does is it takes that wish to be a do not resuscitate, so do not receive CPR equals DNR, do not resuscitate, that wish to take that order into the home as an out-of-hospital medical order. And again, it would be important to talk with your provider about whether you are a good candidate for a Comfort One. There are some limitations to who that document can be completed for. And again, name and date of birth at the bottom of page 3. So we're continuing part 2, instructions for healthcare, and we're going to talk now specifically about some life support treatments. So life support treatments include any medical test, blood product, surgery, procedure, machine, and/or medicine needed to prolong life. And we're going to talk about some very specific medical scenarios and whether you would or would not want this type of life support treatment. In the event that I am unable to speak for myself or make my own medical decisions and/or have an incurable or irreversible condition that will result in my death, and/or I am unconscious and not expected to wake up, and/or the harm of medical treatment would cause more suffering than good. And again, if you want to address all 3 of those here, you can do so. You can also cross out any of those 3 scenarios that don't feel quite right for you, or change the wording if you need to. So initial the one that matters most to you. If you were in one of those above scenarios and unable to speak for yourself, the first option is I want life support treatment to keep me alive as long as possible when medically appropriate, or I want to try life support treatment to see if I will get better, but I want them stopped if I'm not getting better or it is clearly adding to my suffering. So that would be temporary use of life-sustaining treatment. Or I do not want life-sustaining treatment. I wish to allow a natural death with medical treatments focused on providing comfort only. So this last option is I do not want life support treatment. So it's important to understand that you can either, that your healthcare decision maker can either say, I don't want treatment started, or if it's been started, they can authorize the withdrawal or withholding of that life support treatment in order to allow a natural death. This also gives you the option to include, again, other wishes or clarifying anything that you would like to. Those might include what quality of life is important to you or hoped for outcomes. And the next section speaks to artificial nutrition. You may notice over in the little bubble to the right, it speaks about the Dementia Directive. We will get to that in some future in the next couple slides. But right here, we'll talk about artificial nutrition. And again, artificial nutrition is nutrition that is offered through a tube. There's various ways that can be offered to you, but it does not mean that nutrition by mouth would ever be withheld from you. So in the above scenarios, in the event that I am unable to communicate or speak for myself, and I am not able to eat food or drink fluids safely on my own, initial the one that matters most to you around artificial nutrition. I want artificial nutrition when medically appropriate, unless it is clearly adding to my suffering. Or I want to try artificial nutrition for a short time to see if my condition improves, but I want it stopped if I am not getting better. So no long-term use of artificial nutrition. Or I do not want artificial nutrition ever. That's the third option there. There's another opportunity here for you to write other wishes. Another option that is in some other documents is to say how you feel about the use of artificial hydration. So artificial hydration can sometimes relieve suffering. It can sometimes cause suffering, and it most often will prolong the dying process. So if you would want artificial hydration to also be discontinued in order to allow a natural death, that is something that is super helpful to put in writing, and you can do that under other wishes or anything else you want to clarify here. And then again, at the end of page 4 is your name and date of birth. So before we go to the very end of the Alaska document, there's the also comment on artificial hydration, just a note to myself as a reminder. So when we talk about the scenarios in most medical advance directives, they don't necessarily cover dementia. Even though dementia is a terminal condition, it is not necessarily upon first diagnosis going to lead to end of life within a short period of time. Sometimes it can be many, many years when somebody is living with dementia. And of course, the scenario of being in unconscious or an irreversible coma is not the situation of dementia. It could be covered in this document under life-sustaining treatment would cause more suffering than good, but it very much depends on what stage of dementia you're in and what quality of life you have. So again, the American Medical Association has declared dementia to be a terminal condition, and most medical advanced health directives do not necessarily cover the intricacies of dementia. So there is a document which you can use as an addendum or an add-on to this medical directive in order to speak to the kind of medical care you would or would not want in the situation of dementia. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Just to let you know, the document can be downloaded for free on this website, www.dementia-directive.org. So what the Dementia Directive does is it speaks to end-of-life care or medical care in certain stages of dementia. It's a tool to discuss how to match your goals with the care that you are receiving. The document was created by Dr. Barak Gaster from University of Washington in Seattle, Washington. And it is meant to be a healthcare directive for dementia. It is not a standalone legal document. Again, it's meant to be an addendum or an add-on to a legal document. And again, it helps you match goals for medical care to stages of the disease. So I'll just say briefly what the document does, and then I strongly encourage you to go to the website and download the document. If dementia is a concern for you, if it runs in your family, if you have cared for somebody with dementia, if you have really strong feelings about how you would want to be cared for with this specific diagnosis. Very important to complete these documents before a diagnosis of dementia. Again, in order to understand the complexity of the decisions that we have been talking about today, somebody needs to have the cognitive capacity to understand this information. And quite often, once somebody is given a diagnosis of mild dementia, not always, but quite often, that person no longer has the capacity to wrap their heads around these concepts and decisions that we've been talking about today. So how the Dementia Directive works is it's 3 pages, the document itself, and it breaks dementia down into 3 different stages. So 3 pages for 3 stages. And the options for treatment are the same in every stage. So just as you can see here in this slide, you have the option to say, if I had mild dementia, would you want full treatment? Nothing's off the table. I want to live as long as possible and receive full medical care. Or with mild stages of dementia, would you want to consider being a do not resuscitate, allowing a natural death in the case of cardiac arrest? Again, keeping in mind that if somebody who already has mild cognitive decline goes any amount of time without oxygen to the brain, they have the potential of coming out of that situation, if they do survive, with worsening cognitive impairment. And again, with the different stages, the next option would be no more emergency room or hospital. I prefer to receive care in my home. I'm still willing to receive antibiotics and some level of care in the home. Might need to go to the hospital for a serious fracture or need for surgical procedure, but preference is no emergency and no hospital if it can be avoided. And then the last level of care, or the last option, would be comfort-focused care. And what that would mean is no more medical treatment at all, no medicines or treatment to prolong my life. I would like to allow a natural death and focus on comfort. So again, the options are the same in mild, moderate, and severe. And quite often when people are completing this document, they change the level of care that they would want depending on the stage of their dementia and the quality of their living. So again, if dementia is a concern for you and something you want to include in your proactive care planning, I strongly encourage you to go to this website, www.dementia-directive.org, and it is a document created in Washington state, but again, it can be used in any state as an addendum to the state directive. So we're at the end of the Advanced Healthcare Directive and time for signature, but do not sign it until you are in front of 2 witnesses or a notary. So if you're using 2 witnesses, please make sure that you notice the witness requirements and understand who cannot be your witness. So most relevant and important is to understand that your witnesses cannot be related to you by blood or marriage or adoption. They can also not be anyone who is named on the document. So sometimes finding 2 witnesses can be difficult with the restrictions that are in place or the requirements that are in place. So a notary is also an option. For notary, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of local banks offer notary services quite often for free. Lots of UPS stores and shipping stores offer notary services for a small fee. And several senior centers or organizations, community organizations that provide care for their senior populations will often have a list of notary or can help you find a notary. So again, in order to make this a legal document, you will sign it in front of 2 witnesses or a notary. So once the document is complete, first of all, give yourself a big pat on the back once you complete this document, because this is not an easy thing, but in my opinion, one of the most important documents you can complete in your life. Once it is complete, we have created this checklist, which is also available on our website, to just, again, make sure you went through the process as you needed to and checked all the boxes and have everything done. So as we spoke about, a lot of this will be a repeat, is choosing your healthcare agent, most important part of this document, and having a conversation with them about their wishes, have them agree to be named on your legal document. Also a very good idea to have conversation with other family members or anyone who may show up at your bedside who's not named on the document in order to avoid any conflict. Complete the Advanced Healthcare Directive, which includes choosing that healthcare agent and those instructions for healthcare. Sign the document and have it witnessed or notarized. Make copies of the Advanced Healthcare Directive documents. Always keep the original. Very good idea to give copies to who you've chosen as your healthcare agents so they can review them and have access to them. Whoever your primary care provider is, I strongly encourage you to consider scheduling an appointment to talk about your wishes and your values and your Advanced Healthcare Directive with your provider. Most insurances will cover that visit. You may have a copay, but this is a reimbursable visit for providers to be able to have with their patients, and super important for them to understand what your wishes are. And you can carry a copy into your local hospital, mail it into the local hospital, fax it into the hospital. PeaceHealth also has an option to email the document in. So if PeaceHealth is your local hospital, here's the information on how to get your document on file at the hospital. Why would you want to get it on file at the hospital? A huge reason is for easy access. So if you have a sudden event, sudden serious illness or accident, and you are taken to your local hospital, if that is PeaceHealth, your document will be easily found in your medical record and can be used immediately to help guide your care. If you are traveling somewhere, not a bad idea to carry a copy of your document with you. And also be aware that what happens quite often is, let's say something happens and you are visiting Bellingham. or let's think of a hospital place that doesn't have a PeaceHealth hospital. So if you're visiting a town in Idaho and you have an accident and you're taken to a hospital there, quite often what hospitals do is they will call the hospital closest to the home address on your driver's license and say, we have Hilary Walker here in the hospital. Do you have a healthcare agent, or excuse me, durable power of attorney, advanced healthcare directive that we can use to guide her care? And then PeaceHealth can fax that document to the hospital where you are. So super helpful and important to have it on your medical record at the hospital. You can revise these documents at any time, submit a new document, and we always go by the one with the most recent date. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. There's information here for a call to medical records. If you're wondering if you do have a healthcare directive already on file, you can call and find out. So lastly, I'd love to just remind everyone that these documents, we sometimes call them quote unquote living documents because they can be changed at any time, and our lives change and our values change, and what's important to us is change. Our relationships change. So we've come up with an easy way of understanding when these documents should be reviewed, and we talk about the 6 Ds. So at least every decade. I know some people recommend looking at these documents every year on your birthday. I think it's a great idea to look at them more often, but at least every decade. If you go through a divorce, very important to understand that these are legal documents. If you have named your spouse as your medical decision maker and you get divorced, but their name is still on your directive, they likely will be called to be your medical decision maker. So if you go through a divorce, you want to keep that in mind and think about if you no longer want that person to be your medical decision maker, you want to choose somebody else and complete a new document. The 3rd D is diagnosis. So whenever we're given a diagnosis, it can often make us look at our life and what's really important to us. And we may want to relook at the document and make sure it still is in alignment with what's important to us. The 4th D is decline. Decline in health of you or your medical decision maker. So we talked earlier about if you choose your spouse and then your spouse or whoever you've chosen becomes ill themselves, then you may want to consider having somebody else as your medical decision maker. Not required at all. It is up to you who you choose, but just something to consider. The 5th D is death, and what that means is if somebody who you've named on the document has died, you want to relook at the document and just understand that if the number 1 person you named has died, then that alternate agent, that backup person, is now your number 1 person, and also on this document, the only other person named. So again, you want to relook at the document. And the 6th D is distance. And what that means is that if you move from Alaska to another state, it's a very good idea to understand what the laws are in that new state around end of life, around care for the body at time of death, what things to consider when you're completing a medical directive, and take a look and learn what directives are being used in that state. So that said, what often comes up here is, well, if I don't move, but I travel a lot, will my document be honored in another state? So what I can say is that your document would definitely be used to guide your care in another state. The thing that holds most strong in other states is who you choose as your medical decision maker, as long as that document has been witnessed or notarized. As far as the medical treatment, whether those pieces can be honored, it really depends on the state that you're traveling to, what their laws are, and maybe even the facility where you're receiving care. But one thing your healthcare agent does have a right to do is request transfer to a facility that would be best able to follow your document. So just to keep in mind, again, these are some questions that come up as we teach these classes in the community. So I want to thank you for being here for this presentation. We've reached the end of our presentation. It has been my pleasure to guide you through this process, and I want to thank you for being here. Please do visit our website, again, www.peacehealth.org/advanced-care-planning, where you can download the Alaska documents for free, as well as multiple other resources, frequently asked questions, other videos to watch around medical advanced care planning. And it also gives you the option to email the PeaceHealth Advanced Care Planning team. And please do reach out and let us know if you have any additional questions or if we can be of further support. And please do take good care. Bye-bye.